Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a Roman street just before dawn, when the stones are still cool under your bare feet and the air smells faintly of yesterday's smoke and tomorrow's bread. You're standing outside a bakery that never really slept, only dozed with one eye open, because hunger in Rome keeps terrible hours. Somewhere behind a wooden door, embers glow like sleepy eyes, and you already feel the gentle anxiety of timing something important without a single ticking sound to help you. You probably won't survive this with your full attention intact, and honestly, that's kind of the point. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's comforting to know who else is awake or pretending to be. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are a Roman baker now, or at least you're standing close enough that flour dust settles on your sleeves. There is no clock on the wall, no phone buzzing in your pocket, no digital display glowing judgmentally at you. Time is something you feel in your bones and smell in the air. The city itself is your alarm. Roosters argue with each other in the distance, carts groan awake, and somewhere a neighbor coughs like he's been doing that same cough for 20 years. This is how your day begins, not at 6 sharp, but at dark enough that people still want bread when they wake. The mainstream historical fact hiding in all this calm is that Roman cities regulated baking tightly. In places like Pompeii, bakeries were expected to have bread ready early, because bread wasn't a luxury item, it was a daily necessity. The annona, Rome's grain supply system, depended on predictable rhythms. You don't need a clock when the city itself demands consistency. The oven gets fired at roughly the same stretch of night every day because people's stomachs are remarkably reliable instruments. You push open the bakery door and step into warmth that feels alive. The oven dominates the room, a squat domed beast of brick and mortar, already radiating yesterday's heat. You don't ask what time it is. Instead, you ask the fire a question with your hands, hovering your palms near the mouth of the oven. Too hot and you pull back. Too cool and you frown. This is timing before numbers, duration measured by comfort, risk, and a little bit of bravery. There's a quirky tidbit that always makes historians smile. Some Roman bakers are thought to have timed early tasks by listening for specific city sounds. The opening of public baths, the change of the watch, even certain religious calls could act like background bells. You're not checking a clock, you're listening for Rome to clear its throat and say, "All right, we're doing today now." It's strangely intimate, like the city is leaning over and whispering the schedule into your ear. As you begin preparing the fire, you remember that darkness itself is part of the timer. The sky outside the door is not black anymore, but it isn't blue either. It's that uncertain gray where shapes exist without detail. You've learned, over years you barely remember, that this color gives you just enough time to heat the oven, knead the last dough, and slide loaves inside before customers appear like clockwork. Again, not the ticking kind. Historians still argue whether Roman bakers relied more on communal time cues or purely on embodied habit. Was it the city telling you when to act, or your muscles remembering the sequence so well that when stopped being a question at all? Standing here, you suspect it's both. You were part of the rhythm and also responding to it, like a drummer who both keeps time and listens for it. The oven crackles softly as fresh wood catches, and that sound becomes your metronome. Each pop feels like a second passing, even though you'd laugh if someone asked you how long a second is. The fire's voice changes as it settles, lower and steadier, and you relax a fraction. That relaxation is important. Anxiety rushes bread. Calm bakes it properly. Ancient wisdom, modern therapy advice. Same thing, really. Outside, footsteps pass. Someone is late for something or early for something else. You don't know which, and you don't care. Your job is to be ready when they are hungry. You adjust the fire, already knowing that in a little while, when the light shifts just so and the oven breathes evenly, it will be time for the first loaves. Not because a clock said so, but because everything else did. You take one more look at the door, the sky, the fire. Time, for now, is behaving itself, and without realizing it, you've already started counting.
You don't leave the oven once the fire is going. You orbit it, slow and familiar, like a small moon tied to a brick planet. The oven's mouth yawns open, dark and round, and you lean closer, not foolishly close, but close enough that your eyebrows feel mildly threatened. This is where timing lives now, not in minutes, but in masonry. Roman ovens are built thick on purpose, layers of brick and mortar designed to soak up heat and then release it slowly, generously, like an old relative who insists you take leftovers home. The mainstream historical fact anchoring you here is simple. Most Roman bread ovens were domed, enclosed structures heated directly by fire before baking. The fire goes in first, the loaves later. There's no flame licking the bread itself once baking begins. Instead, the oven's stored heat does the work, and that means timing is inseparable from construction. You're not just baking bread, you're collaborating with architecture. You reach inside with a long tool and adjust the firewood, feeling the resistance of hot air push back at you. The oven's walls are already whispering warmth. You know from experience that a well-built oven holds heat long enough to bake multiple batches if you treat it right. Too impatient, and you scorch the first loaves and curse the rest of the day. Too timid, and everything comes out pale and apologetic. There's a quirky little detail that survives in descriptions and experiments. Some bakers judged oven readiness by tossing in a pinch of flour. If it blackened instantly, the oven was too hot. If it browned slowly, you were close. If it just sat there, insulted, you needed more fire. Congratulations, you've invented the world's most primitive thermostat, and it smells faintly like disappointment when you get it wrong. You step back and watch the oven breathe. That's not poetic nonsense. Ovens really do have a rhythm. As heat builds, air moves differently. The crackling shifts from sharp snaps to a steady murmur. Ash settles. The dome above the fire changes color, dark soot gradually burning off to reveal lighter brick beneath. This visual change is one of your most reliable timers. When the blackness retreats upward, you know the oven is reaching its working heat. Historians still argue whether Roman bakers had a standardized target temperature in mind, or if hot enough was entirely contextual. Was there an ideal, or was each bakery its own little universe of acceptable results? Watching the soot fade, you suspect the latter. Precision exists, but it's personal. Your oven is not your neighbor's oven, and Rome is a city built on that kind of stubborn individuality. You move around the oven again, feeling the floor warmth through the soles of your feet. It's faint, but it's there, and that tells you something too. Heat sinking into the ground means the oven is charging itself properly. This is slow time, the kind modern people try to recreate with sourdough starters and podcasts about mindfulness. You're living it because you don't have another option. A light joke drifts through your mind, uninvited. If someone invented a clock right now, you'd probably ignore it and keep staring at bricks anyway. Another, this oven has better emotional regulation than most people you know. And a third, just to keep the tradition alive, if the oven could talk, it would absolutely complain about being rushed. You scrape out excess embers, listening to the change in sound as glowing wood hits stone. The pitch drops. That's another cue. High, angry crackling means active fire. Lower, softer sounds mean stored heat taking over. You're switching phases now, and you do it without announcing it, without ceremony. Timing happens quietly when you're good at it. Outside, the sky is lighter, but still gentle. Inside, the oven radiates a steady, confident warmth. You press the back of your hand near the opening, counting heartbeats until it becomes uncomfortable. Not seconds, heartbeats. Faster today than yesterday because you had a bit of wine last night, and yes, that actually matters. Your body is part of the instrument, slightly unreliable but always present. There's another fringe idea that floats around scholarly circles, that bakers internalized oven timing so deeply that they could sense when heat peaked without checking anything at all, almost like muscle memory. Skeptics roll their eyes, but experimental archaeologists quietly admit it's possible. After enough repetition, you don't measure anymore, you recognize. You slide the last of the firewood aside and prepare the space for bread. The oven is ready, not because a dial says so, but because everything has aligned. The soot, the sound, the warmth, your own calm. Time has been absorbed into brick and habit. You don't rush, you don't wait too long, you move exactly when it feels right. And somehow, against all modern instincts, that's enough.
You reach for wood the way other people reach for settings on a machine, except nothing clicks and nothing beeps. The pile beside the oven isn't random. It never is. You've stacked it with intention, separating pieces by size, age, and type, because firewood is time wearing a disguise. Each log promises a different pace, a different temperament, and you've learned, sometimes painfully, that choosing wrong means your entire morning drifts off course. Here's the mainstream historical fact grounding this moment. Roman bakers were highly selective about fuel. Archaeological evidence and ancient writings show that different woods were preferred for different tasks, with olive, oak, and pine all commonly used depending on region and availability. Fuel wasn't just about heat, it was about control. In a world without clocks, control equals timing. You lift a piece of olive wood, dense and slightly oily, heavier than it looks. This burns slow and steady, a long conversation rather than a shout. Oak does something similar, though with a deeper, more stubborn heat that lingers like a memory. Pine, on the other hand, is dramatic, quick to catch, quick to flare, quick to be done. You don't judge, you just plan. You feed the oven a mix, because pure anything is risky. Pine to wake it up, oak to stabilize it, olive to hold the line. This is how you stretch and compress time without realizing that's what you're doing. Fast flame to get going, slow burn to maintain. You're not counting minutes, you're blending behaviors. A quirky tidbit slips in here, almost unnoticed. Some ancient sources hint that bakers could smell when a certain wood had finished its useful phase. Not the smoke, but the absence of it. When pine stops shouting and oak settles into a low, even glow, your nose registers the shift before your brain labels it. It's not mystical, it's just practice layered over years until it feels like instinct. You crouch near the oven mouth and listen. Pine pops sharply, impatient like it's tapping its foot. Oak answers with a quieter sound, slower and more deliberate. Olive barely speaks at all, but its heat wraps the space in a steady calm. These sounds become your internal timeline. Sharp pops mean early stage. Soft murmurs mean you're approaching readiness. Silence, well, silence means you've waited too long and nobody enjoys that conversation. Historians still argue whether fuel choice alone could reliably regulate baking time, or if it only worked in combination with visual and tactile cues. Was wood the primary timer, or just one voice in a crowded chorus? As you add another log with careful indifference, you suspect the truth is boring and beautiful. It's everything together, inseparable. You've also learned to read ash. Fine, pale ash tells you a log has given up most of its energy. Darker chunks mean there's still something to be had. You rake gently, watching how ash falls, how embers respond. This isn't busy work. This is adjustment. Every movement nudges the oven's future by a few heartbeats. A light joke drifts through your mind as you work. Somewhere in the future, people will argue online about the best wood for pizza like it's a personality trait. Another follows quickly. If wood could review you, pine would complain you never commit, oak would call you predictable, and olive would just nod approvingly. Third joke, because tradition matters. This is technically multitasking, but it's the relaxing kind. The smell changes as different woods take their turn. Pine gives a sharp resinous edge that wakes your sinuses. Oak smells deeper, almost sweet. Olive has a richness that feels expensive, even if it isn't. You don't consciously label these smells, but your body reacts to them. Certain scents tell you the oven is moving too fast. Others reassure you that you have time to breathe. There's another fringe idea that floats through experimental archaeology circles, that bakers could intentionally slow a bake by switching fuel mid-process, effectively stretching time to match demand. Skeptics point to the risk. Believers point to consistency in surviving bread remains. Standing here, you know it's risky, but not impossible. Risk is part of the craft. Timing without clocks always is. You adjust the fuel again, smaller pieces now, fine-tuning rather than building. The oven responds subtly, not with drama, but with steadiness. This is the phase where impatience ruins things. You resist the urge to hurry because you've learned that wood remembers how it was treated. Rush it and it burns unevenly. Respect it and it gives you exactly what you need. Outside, the street is louder now. Vendors call out. Footsteps multiply. Your awareness stretches to include all of it, but your focus stays here, with fire and brick. Time is thick in this moment, layered with choices you made minutes or heartbeats ago. You step back, satisfied. The fire is doing what it should, at the pace you intended. The oven is no longer waking up, it's thinking, and without a single number passing through your mind, you know you're right on schedule. You're no longer watching the fire so much as you're watching what the fire leaves behind. The flames have done their loud work. Now the quieter signals take over. Color, sound, scent. This is where your real timing begins, the kind that lives just under conscious thought. You lean in, eyes half-lidded, not because you're sleepy, but because you've learned that squinting helps you see change better. Brightness lies, subtle shifts tell the truth. Here's the mainstream historical fact anchoring this moment. Roman bakers judged doneness primarily by sensory cues. There were no written baking times, no universal standards measured in minutes. Instead, experienced bakers relied on visual browning, the sound of crusts, and the smell of baked grain to decide when bread was ready. Bread wasn't done at 10 minutes. It was done when it looked, sounded, and smelled right. You slide the first loaves into the oven, and instantly the air changes. The oven exhales around them, a soft rush of heat that feels intentional, like it's been waiting for this exact moment. You close the mouth and step back, already listening. Silence at first, then faint crackles, not from fire now, but from dough surrendering moisture, from crusts beginning their slow transformation. You count nothing. Instead, you watch color creep. Pale dough turns creamy, then warm, then gradually deepens. It's not uniform. One edge darkens faster. You make a mental note and adjust the loaf's position later. Timing here is uneven by nature, and your job isn't to force uniformity, but to respond to difference. A quirky tidbit drifts in from the edges of scholarship. Some bakers are thought to have tapped loaves to listen for hollowness, much like modern bread testing. The idea that ancient Romans knocked on bread and nodded thoughtfully is oddly comforting. You give one loaf a gentle tap with your tool. The sound is dull, not ready. You leave it alone. Interference at the wrong moment is how you ruin things. The smell arrives next, and it's impossible to ignore. Raw flour scent fades, replaced by something richer, sweeter, almost nutty. This is the Maillard reaction doing its ancient, uncelebrated work, though you don't have a name for it. You just know that when the bakery smells like this, you're getting close. Too soon and the scent is flat. Too late and there's a bitter edge that makes your jaw tighten. Historians still argue whether smell was the most important timing cue or merely a confirmation of visual readiness. Some insist aroma lags behind doneness, others argue it leads it. Standing here, you'd say smell is the emotional cue. Your eyes decide, your nose reassures or panics. The crackling grows more pronounced now, a soft chorus of tiny snaps as crusts firm and expand. You listen for a specific texture of sound, something between whisper and pop.
Too quiet and the bread is still steaming internally. Too loud and you've waited a touch too long. There it is, that middle place. You smile without realizing it. Light jokes wander through your mind because routine invites them. One, if bread could talk, it would absolutely complain about being watched like this. Two, this is the original ASMR, and you're very into it. Three, somewhere far in the future, people will pay extra for artisan timing and have no idea what that actually means. You open the oven briefly to check color, and heat rushes out like a living thing. The loaves below, not literally, but with that illusion of warmth that makes them look brighter than they are. The crust has split slightly along one edge, a sign of good expansion. You nod. This is what you were waiting for, though you never articulated it. There's another fringe idea scholars occasionally whisper about, that bakers could judge remaining bake time by the pitch of the crackling alone, without looking. High-frequency sounds early, lower ones later as moisture decreases. It sounds implausible until you stand here doing exactly that, ears tuned like you're listening for a baby to wake up in the next room. You rotate the loaves, efficient and careful. The oven's heat is not democratic. Some spots are more persuasive than others. You compensate instinctively, moving bread through zones like pieces on a board you know by heart. Each movement resets a tiny internal timer, not measured, just felt. The color deepens again, golden now, edging toward brown. Not the dramatic dark people will romanticize centuries later, but something practical, nourishing. You watch for the moment when color stops changing quickly. That plateau is important. It tells you most of the chemical drama is done, and what remains is refinement. Too long here, and refinement becomes regret. You lean closer and inhale. The smell has rounded out, lost its sharpness. There's no rawness left. This is the scent customers will follow down the street without realizing why. Bread advertising itself, perfectly on schedule. Another small sound reaches you, the loaf's crust contracting as it sets, faint ticking noises like a clock that refuses to admit what it is. You almost laugh. Time finally shows up, and it does so quietly, politely, without numbers. Historians still argue whether such sensory timing could be consistent across different bakers or if it required years of embodied practice. Was this knowledge transferable or deeply personal? You suspect the answer is uncomfortable for modern minds. It's teachable, but only slowly, and only to those willing to pay attention longer than feels reasonable. You remove the loaves at the exact moment when everything agrees, the color, the sound, the smell, your own calm. The oven seems to relax afterward, like it's done something worthwhile. You set the bread aside to cool, listening as it continues to whisper and crackle, still marking time, even after it's done. And just like that, you've measured a stretch of time without measuring it at all.
You step away from the oven, not because your work is done, but because the bread needs a different kind of time now. Cooling time, the kind nobody respects anymore. You place the loaves on a wooden surface that's been worn smooth by decades of similar mornings, and you listen again. Bread fresh from the oven continues to speak, tiny crackles and sighs as steam escapes and the crust settles into itself. If you rush this part, if you cut too soon, the inside turns gummy and sulks. Timing doesn't stop just because the heat does. The mainstream historical fact grounding this quieter phase is that Roman bread was typically sold the same day it was baked, often within hours. Cooling, slicing, and selling followed a well-understood rhythm. Bakers knew that bread wasn't truly finished when it left the oven. It needed a brief rest to become itself. Even without clocks, this post-bake interval was respected because customers noticed when it wasn't. You rest your hands on the table and feel warmth radiating upward. Not hot now, comfortably warm like the memory of fire. This warmth fades slowly, and that fading is another timer.
When the loaf no longer warms your palms, it's ready to be moved, stacked, sold. Until then, you wait, pretending you're not waiting. A quirky tidbit lingers here. Some Roman bakeries may have staggered cooling loaves strategically, placing earlier batches closer to the door where cooler air circulated, later batches deeper inside. Not proven, but plausible. You do it without thinking, nudging one loaf slightly aside, spacing them just enough that air can pass. You're shaping time again, even now. Outside, the city has fully awakened. Voices overlap. Someone laughs, someone argues. Somewhere a bell rings, not for you, but you hear it anyway. You notice how these sounds line up with your work. Bread cools as markets open. Timing aligns across trades without coordination, like everyone's following the same invisible conductor. Historians still argue whether Roman urban life ran on an implicit shared schedule or a collection of loosely synchronized habits. Was there an unspoken timetable or just mutual adaptation? As you watch a loaf's steam finally fade, you suspect both. The city doesn't need clocks when everyone pays attention. You test one loaf gently, pressing the crust. It resists, then springs back. That's the signal. Not a number, not a rule, just a response. You nod, satisfied. Another small joke passes through your mind. Modern people buy devices to track time spent resting, while you're here timing rest by touch. Progress is complicated. You stack the loaves, careful not to trap heat. Too close and they sweat. Too far and you waste space. Balance again. Always balance. Even timing is a balancing act. There's a fringe scholarly idea that cooling bread was as culturally ingrained as baking it, that customers expected a certain texture that only came from properly cooled loaves, and bakers who rushed this step lost trust. You believe it. People may not know why something feels wrong, but they know when it does. You wipe flour from your hands and finally allow yourself to slow. The urgent part is over. The bread is ready, the oven is calm, the city is moving at its steady pace. You've navigated hours without hours, minutes without minutes, guided only by senses, habit, and attention. And now, gently, the day releases you. Your movements soften. There's nothing left to adjust, nothing left to check. The loaves sit quietly now. No more crackling, no more steam, just the faint, comforting presence of something finished properly. You take a slow breath and notice how the room feels different, less tense, less expectant. The oven radiates a fading warmth, like a memory that hasn't quite let go yet. Outside sounds blur together into a steady hush. Not silence, just background, the kind that doesn't demand anything from you. You realize how tired your body is, not in a heavy way, but in a satisfied one. This is the exhaustion that comes from paying attention for a long time. You lean against the wall, eyes drifting half closed. The smell of bread lingers, softer now, warmer, less sharp. It wraps around you, familiar and reassuring. No clocks tick, no alarms wait. Time stretches out, unmeasured and kind. If someone asked how long all this took, you wouldn't know how to answer. And standing here, calm and grounded, you understand that you don't need to. The work happened, the bread is good, the city will eat. You let your breathing slow, matching the room, matching the quiet. Thoughts drift without urgency, the oven cools, the day continues without you needing to chase it.
You return to the workbench, hands dusted with flour again, because timing doesn't end with fire and cooling. It sinks deeper, into the dough itself, into memory stored in muscles rather than tools. This is the part outsiders rarely notice, how much of Roman baking time lives in your hands long before the oven is hot. You don't measure dough, you remember it. The mainstream historical fact threading through this moment is that Roman bakers worked with relatively consistent dough formulas, often using sourdough starters passed down through a bakery for generations. These starters behaved predictably only if you understood them intimately. Fermentation time wasn't written down, It was learned, adjusted daily by feel, smell, and texture. The clock, once again, was you. You press your fingers into a lump of dough resting under cloth. It yields slowly, then pushes back. Too fast, and it's underdeveloped. Too sluggish, and it's gone too far. This resistance tells you how long it has rested. Even if you never consciously tracked that rest, your palms know whether the dough waited patiently or grew restless. There's a quirky tidbit that slips into this rhythm. Some ancient bakers are believed to have named their dough starters, treating them almost like co-workers with moods and habits. While direct evidence is thin, the practice survives in later baking traditions. And honestly, you get it. This dough absolutely has a personality today, and it's being a little dramatic. You lift the cloth and inhale. The smell is lightly sour, not sharp. That tells you enough time has passed, but not too much. Fermentation is slow time, invisible time, and it rewards attention more than precision. You've learned that warmer mornings shorten it, cooler ones stretch it. Weather is another clock, rude but effective. Historians still argue whether Roman bakers intentionally manipulated fermentation timing to match oven schedules, or if the process simply adapted itself naturally over generations of habit. Did bakers say, "I need this ready by then," or did the dough quietly train them instead? Standing here, you suspect the dough usually won. You begin shaping loaves, movements smooth and economical. There's no rush, because rush shows in bread. Each fold traps air, and you sense how lively the dough feels today. Livelier means it needs less time later. Slower means patience. You're constantly recalibrating, like adjusting an internal watch that never fully stops ticking. A few light jokes drift through your thoughts because repetition invites them. One, this dough is more responsive than most conversations you've had this week. Two, if modern people had to time fermentation by vibes alone, there would be chaos. Three, somewhere in the future, someone will invent proofing timers and still get it wrong. You set the shaped loaves aside, spacing them just right. Not too close, crowding speeds things up. Not too far, distance slows them down. Space itself becomes a tool for time management. Airflow matters. You notice a faint draft near the doorway and adjust accordingly, nudging one loaf away from it. That loaf just gained a few extra heartbeats of rest. There's a fringe scholarly idea that Roman bakers could predict fermentation progress by sound alone. The faint fizzing of active dough, audible in quiet rooms. It sounds romantic, maybe exaggerated, but you pause and listen anyway. There it is, barely there, a soft, almost imagined whisper of life. You smile. Not everything needs to be proven to be useful. You touch the dough again, gently. It clings to your skin just enough to say it's alive, not enough to be annoying. That balance tells you it's nearly ready. You don't need to ask how long it's been sitting. Your hands remember when you set it down, not in minutes, but in context. Before the oven settled, after the first batch cooled, while the city noise shifted. Outside, the street sounds change again, a different cadence now, less frantic, more routine. That tells you something too. Bread aligns with human activity. When people slow, dough often does too. You don't overthink it, you just adjust. Historians still argue whether this kind of embodied timing can truly replace mechanical measurement. Critics call it imprecise, practitioners call it sufficient. You'd add a third word, resilient. When conditions change, and they always do, numbers fail faster than attention. You prepare these loaves for their turn in the oven, knowing exactly how long they should wait without ever framing that knowledge in numbers. It's a strange confidence, quiet and unshowy, the kind that comes from doing the same thing carefully every day. The oven waits, the dough waits, you wait too, but not idly.
You're listening, watching, feeling. Time hasn't disappeared, it's just dissolved into everything else. And when you finally move again, it's because something, not a clock, told you to. You notice the apprentices before you hear them properly, because timing has taught you to sense disruption early. They hover near the doorway, trying very hard not to look like they're counting anything. Their lips move faintly, breaths maybe, or words, or both. You don't call them out on it. Everyone starts somewhere, and everyone starts by needing something countable. The mainstream historical fact threading through this moment is that Roman bakeries relied heavily on apprenticeships. Skills weren't written down in manuals, they were absorbed through repetition, correction, and observation. Timing, especially, was taught indirectly. You didn't say, wait this long. You said, wait until it feels like this, and then you waited together. One apprentice shapes dough too quickly, hands darting like nervous birds. You gently slow him down with a look, not a glare, just a look that says you're racing something that isn't chasing you. He exhales and adjusts, his shoulders dropping. You can almost hear his internal counting stop. Good. Counting makes people tense, and tension lies. There's a quirky tidbit that surfaces in accounts of ancient trades. Apprentices often timed tasks by repeating phrases or prayers under their breath, not for devotion, though that helped, but for rhythm. A short chant could keep hands moving evenly without encouraging haste. You catch a fragment of murmured words and let it pass. Whatever keeps them steady is fine by you. You demonstrate a simple motion and let them watch. No explanation. Explanation invites questions, and questions invite numbers. Instead, you show pace, how long you pause, how lightly you touch the dough, how you wait for resistance before moving again. This is instruction through imitation, and it's slow on purpose. Historians still argue whether such embodied teaching methods limited innovation or preserved quality. Did this slow, non-verbal transfer of knowledge trap bakers in tradition, or did it free them from rigid rules? Watching an apprentice finally relax into the rhythm, you suspect freedom comes later. First comes fluency. One apprentice glances at the door, clearly tempted to use the street sounds as a cue. You allow it. The city is a teacher too. When the fountain outside shifts from lonely splashing to constant chatter, something always changes inside the bakery as well. You don't point it out. You let him notice it on his own. Discovery sticks better than instruction. A few light jokes wander through your thoughts because teaching always invites them. 1. If apprentices could bake bread by worrying, Rome would never go hungry. 2. The fastest way to learn patience is to be surrounded by people who already have it. 3. Someday, these same apprentices will complain about kids these days rushing everything. You hand one of them a tool and nod toward the oven. Not yet, but soon. He waits, visibly unsure. This is the hardest lesson, not acting when you want to. You watch his breathing slow as he resists the urge. When the moment finally arrives, you give the smallest nod. Relief flashes across his face, followed by pride. He didn't miss it. He felt it. There's a fringe scholarly idea that some apprentices learned timing by deliberately being made to fail, pulled too early, pushed too late, until contrast sharpened their instincts. You remember your own failures vividly, the burned edges, the pale centers. Pain is an excellent teacher, unfortunately. You don't shield them completely, you just keep the failures survivable. You correct another apprentice's spacing, moving loaves a finger width apart. That finger width matters more than any minute ever could. Space changes airflow, airflow changes rise, rise changes bake, bake changes everything. He nods, not fully understanding, but trusting you enough to accept it. Historians still argue whether Roman craftsmen conceptualized time abstractly or purely through action. Did bakers think in durations at all, or only in sequences? As you watch your apprentices move from stiffness to flow, you realize sequence might be the answer. First this, then that. When this changes, do that. Time becomes a story, not a scale. The apprentices grow quieter as the work settles. No more murmuring, no more counting breaths, just movement, observation, correction. They're not good yet. That's fine. They're learning to wait, and waiting is the foundation of everything you do. You step back and let them work, resisting the urge to intervene too often. Timing can't be handed over. It has to be grown, slowly, patiently, without numbers. And somewhere between their first confident movements and their last nervous glances at the door, you know they're starting to hear what you hear. The soft, unspoken signal that says, now.
The street outside becomes part of your kitchen without ever crossing the threshold. You don't need to look up to know what's happening out there. The sounds carry everything you need. Wooden wheels rattle over stone in a rhythm you've memorized without trying. A vendor's call stretches long today, which tells you business is good and people are unhurried. That matters. When the city slows, you slow with it. When it rushes, you adjust. This is how you keep time without owning it. The mainstream historical fact grounding this moment is that Roman urban life followed strong daily patterns. Markets opened and filled at predictable hours. Fountains drew crowds at certain times, and street noise rose and fell in waves. Bakers worked inside this soundscape, using it, consciously or not, as a reliable external cue. The city itself functioned like a giant, messy clock. You pause mid-motion as a familiar sound cuts through the general noise, the splash-slap rhythm of water carriers at the nearby fountain. That sound always lands in the same part of your day, and it tells you more than any shadow could. It means customers will start arriving soon, which means the next batch needs to be almost ready. Not perfect yet, just close. A quirky tidbit floats up from the edges of scholarship. Some historians believe bakers deliberately chose locations near predictable noise sources, fountains, markets, baths, because the rhythms helped structure their workday. Not proven, but it makes sense. You smile at the thought that urban planning accidentally created acoustic timekeepers. Inside the bakery, you shift your weight and listen more closely. The apprentices have gone quiet again, which tells you they're concentrating. The oven hums low and steady. Outside, a cart creaks to a stop, followed by voices negotiating. That pause and movement is important. It tells you a transition is happening. Time, once again, announces itself indirectly. Historians still argue whether Romans were consciously aware of using environmental cues to track time, or if it was entirely subconscious. Were you thinking, ah yes, the cart has stopped, therefore X, or were you simply responding without reflection? Standing here, you realize it doesn't matter. Awareness doesn't change effectiveness. You adjust a loaf's position, just slightly, reacting to a shift in airflow caused by the door opening and closing as someone passes by outside. Even that matters. Sound leads to movement. Movement leads to air. Air leads to timing changes. Everything is connected, whether you acknowledge it or not. A few light jokes drift through your mind because your brain enjoys filling quiet spaces. 1. If modern productivity experts heard you timing bread by fountain splashes, they'd cry. 2. This city is louder than any alarm you'll ever need. 3. Rome may not be built in a day, but it sure wakes up fast. The noise outside swells again, layered now. Footsteps, voices, metal on stone. You feel a mild pressure in your chest. Not stress, just alertness. This is the moment when mistakes happen if you let the city rush you. You consciously slow your hands, grounding yourself in texture and resistance. The outside world can be frantic. Your bread cannot. There's a fringe idea that some bakers synchronize their work to religious processions or civic events, using bells and chants as anchors. While you don't rely on those today, you've noticed how the tone of the city changes when something official is happening. The soundscape tightens, becomes more formal. On those days, you plan differently. Timing adapts to mood as much as schedule. You catch a familiar call, someone advertising fruit. That vendor always arrives slightly before your first customers. Always. You don't know his name, but you know his timing better than some relatives. You nod to yourself. The next step approaches. Historians still argue whether such informal cues could ever replace standardized timekeeping once mechanical clocks appeared. Skeptics say no. Supporters say these systems worked perfectly until disrupted. You suspect both are right. The system is elegant, but it requires attention. Lose that, and everything collapses. You signal an apprentice with a glance. He understands. He doesn't ask why. He simply adjusts his pace to match yours. That's the real lesson you're teaching. Not how long to wait, but how to notice when waiting is over. The city outside surges forward again, and inside, you move with it, but not because you're being pushed, because you're listening. Time doesn't shout here. It murmurs through footsteps and wheels and voices, and you've learned its language fluently. When the door finally opens and the first customer steps inside, you're ready. Not early, not late, exactly when the street said you would be.
You lean toward the oven again, eyes narrowing slightly, because this is the moment where experience outweighs everything else. Anyone can feel heat. Fewer can read it. The embers glow a particular shade now. Not fierce, not dull, but steady, like they've settled into themselves. This is where seasoned eyes matter. Timing here lives in color and depth, not brightness alone. The mainstream historical fact anchoring this scene is that Roman bakers judged oven temperature visually by ember color and ash behavior. Bright white ash suggested intense heat, darker, thicker ash meant cooling. Red-orange embers held usable warmth longer than yellow flames. These cues weren't written down, but they were widely understood among craftsmen. Fire, in Rome, was a language you learned early. You rake embers gently, not to stir drama, but to see how they respond. They resist, then shift, holding together instead of scattering. Good. That cohesion tells you the heat is even, not spiky. Uneven heat is the enemy of good timing. It lies to you. Hot in one instant, gone the next. A quirky tidbit floats up from experimental archaeology. Some modern researchers found that experienced bakers can estimate oven temperature within a surprisingly narrow range just by looking at ember glow. No instruments, no thermometers, just practice. Skeptics hate this. Practitioners shrug. You're with the shrug crowd. You squat and peer into the oven's belly, careful not to rush. The dome above is clean now, soot burned away completely. That alone tells you how long the fire has been working. Soot doesn't disappear instantly. It retreats gradually as sustained heat does its job. You trace that retreat with your eyes, mapping time backwards. This much soot gone means this much heat held for this long. You don't translate it into numbers, you translate it into confidence. Historians still argue whether Roman bakers conceptualized this as temperature at all, or simply as states of readiness. Did you think hotter and cooler, or right and not yet? Watching the embers pulse gently, you realize right is enough. Precision isn't the same as accuracy, and accuracy is what feeds people. You extend a tool inside and touch the oven floor briefly, then withdraw it. The response is immediate but not violent. The tool darkens slightly but doesn't scorch. Another cue locked. Your mind holds dozens of these tiny signals simultaneously, weaving them into a single judgment that feels effortless only because it isn't. A few light jokes drift through your thoughts because concentration leaves room for them. 1. If fire had moods, this one is cooperative. 2. Modern people would absolutely invent an app to tell you this and still ask the fire anyway. 3. Embers are like opinions, loud at first, quieter when they've settled into something useful. You glance at the apprentices, making sure they're watching without hovering. This is not a lesson you can explain well. You have to let them see you hesitate, adjust, wait. That hesitation is part of the timing. Acting too quickly here costs you later. There's a fringe scholarly idea that bakers trained their eyes by deliberately over-firing ovens early in their careers, learning the difference between aggressive and sustained heat the hard way. You wince at the memory of your own early mistakes, the days when everything came out bitter or brittle. Fire teaches by consequence, not suggestion. You rake embers gently, listening to the sound it makes as it hits the stone floor. Soft, powdery falls mean the oven has settled. Sharp clinks mean leftover aggression. Today, it's mostly soft. You note again, another confirmation. Historians still argue whether this visual judgment could remain consistent across different lighting conditions: early morning, bright midday, smoky interiors. Did bakers compensate subconsciously, or did errors simply increase? You suspect compensation. Humans are excellent at adjusting when they must be. We only forget that when machines do it for us. You step back and feel the heat on your face, not just intensity, but quality. Dry heat feels different from damp. Dry means the oven has driven out moisture from its own walls, which means it will pull moisture from the bread efficiently. That affects timing too. Moist ovens lie, dry ovens tell the truth. The embers dim slightly as you close the oven mouth again, sealing the environment. You don't panic, you expect this. Heat redistributes. This is the part novices misread, thinking the oven has cooled too quickly. You know better. This is heat settling into work mode. You watch the apprentices' faces as they try to read what you are seeing. They're not there yet, and that's fine. One of them squints harder as if vision alone will do the job. It won't. You almost laugh. Timing lives in the body first, eye second.
There's another fringe idea scholars sometimes mention quietly, that bakers could tell oven readiness by how their own skin reacted, how fast sweat formed or evaporated near the opening. It sounds subjective, and it is, but subjectivity isn't weakness here, it's calibration. Your body is an instrument that's been tuned by years of exposure. You feel it now. The heat is assertive but respectful. It doesn't chase you back, it invites you closer, then holds steady. That's the signal you've been waiting for. Not dramatic, not obvious, just right. You signal again, subtle, efficient. The next loaves move into position. No one speaks, no one needs to. The oven is ready, and everyone feels it, even if they can't explain why. Time, once again, has been read. Not measured, not recorded, but understood. And as the embers glow softly behind closed stone, you know the fire will keep its promise.
You start to notice how often your work aligns with things that have nothing to do with bread at all. The oven is hot, the loaves are inside, and somewhere beyond the walls of the bakery, the city's larger routines are clicking into place. You don't see them, but you feel them, like pressure changes before a storm. This is where Rome's public life quietly lends you its timing. The mainstream historical fact anchoring this stretch of the day is that Roman cities ran on shared civic rhythms. Public baths opened and closed at roughly predictable times, markets peaked and thinned, bells rang for administrative or religious reasons. Even without personal clocks, these recurring events created a loose but dependable framework of time that craftsmen, including bakers, could synchronize with. You hear it now, the distant sound of a bell, not sharp enough to demand attention, but clear enough to register. It's not meant for you. It's probably signaling something mundane, an opening, a transition, a reminder. But your body responds anyway. That bell always sounds when your second batch should be well underway. Always. You don't question it anymore. A quirky tidbit lingers here. Some scholars think bakers intentionally aligned their busiest moments with bathhouse schedules because customers leaving the baths were hungry and predictable. Warm, relaxed people buy bread without haggling much. You grin faintly at the thought. Timing isn't just about cooking, it's about catching people at the right moment. Inside, the apprentices glance up at the bell sound, then back to you. You don't comment. You don't need to. They're starting to understand that timing isn't owned by the bakery. It's borrowed from the city. You're syncing yourself to something larger, like setting your watch by a river rather than the sun. Historians still argue whether these civic cues created a true shared sense of time across social classes, or if they were interpreted differently by everyone. Did a bell mean the same thing to a senator as it did to a baker? Probably not. But repetition smooths differences. Even vague signals become precise when you hear them every day. You check the oven again, quick and practiced. The loaves are progressing exactly as expected, which reassures you that your alignment with the city hasn't thrown anything off. This is important. External timing cues only work if they don't distract you from internal ones. Balance, again. A few light jokes drift lazily through your thoughts. 1. If Rome ever stopped ringing bells, half the city would miss lunch. 2. Modern people complain about notifications, but at least theirs can be silenced. 3. This bell has better punctuality than most meetings you'll ever attend. You remember days when the routine was broken. Festivals, emergencies, unexpected processions. On those days, everything felt off. Bread came out too early or too late, not because the oven changed, but because the city did. Those days taught you how dependent timing is on stability. When the world shifts, your internal clock wobbles. There's a fringe scholarly idea that bakers acted as informal timekeepers themselves because people gauged the day's progress by when bread became available. Has the baker opened yet? Was a common question, and the answer carried temporal weight. I like that idea. It means your work doesn't just follow time, it helps create it. I glance toward the door as footsteps approach. Not customers yet, just passers-by, but soon. The sound density outside is thickening, voices overlapping more tightly. That usually means you have one final adjustment window before the rush. You make it, small and precise, nudging a loaf, sealing the oven mouth again. Historians still argue whether such layered timing systems, fire, dough, city, were fragile or robust. Critics say one disruption could cascade into failure. Practitioners say redundancy is strength. You quietly side with the practitioners. If one cue fails, another speaks up. That's why this works. The bell fades, replaced by everyday noise. You feel a gentle release of tension, like something has clicked into place. The city is moving forward, and you're moving with it. Not chasing, not lagging. When the oven door opens again, the loaves are ready for their next stage, exactly when the broader rhythm says they should be. You didn't plan it that way, you just listened. Time today is being generous, and you accept that gift without comment, sliding the work forward as Rome hums around you. You've learned more from your mistakes than from any smooth morning, and the oven remembers those days even if you'd rather forget them. Burned crusts, collapsed loaves, bread pulled too early because the street got loud and you panicked. Failure leaves residue. Not on the bricks, but on you.
Timing sharpens fastest when it hurts a little. The mainstream historical fact threading through this part of the day is that Roman bakers operated under real pressure. Bread quality mattered economically and socially, and repeated failures could cost customers or invite fines in tightly regulated cities. There was no margin for endless experimentation. Mistakes weren't abstract lessons, they were immediate and public. You still remember a morning years ago when the oven ran hotter than you realized. The embers looked friendly, the dome looked clean, but you trusted your eyes more than your skin. The loaves came out dark, brittle, smelling faintly bitter. Customers noticed. They always do. That day taught you something no instruction ever could. Timing doesn't forgive confidence without attention. A quirky tidbit surfaces from fringe scholarship. Some researchers believe bakers deliberately pushed boundaries during quieter periods, experimenting with heat and timing when fewer customers were watching. Late afternoons, off days, those were the laboratories. You nod to yourself. That sounds right. Risk belongs where consequences are smaller. You adjust the oven now with extra care, informed by those memories. Every correction you make carries the weight of a past mistake. You're not haunted by them, you're guided. Timing improves because you remember what happens when it slips. Historians still argue whether ancient craftsmen conceptualized failure as learning in the modern sense, or simply as error to be avoided. Did bakers reflect and adapt, or did tradition absorb mistakes quietly over generations? Standing here, you know reflection happened, even if it wasn't written down. People don't repeat pain unless they have to. An apprentice pulls a loaf a fraction too early, eager, hopeful. You don't scold. You let him see the pale interior when it's cut later. Let the bread explain the problem. His shoulders sink. Good. That lesson will stick. You give a reassuring nod. Everyone does this once. Some do it twice. Few do it 3 times. A few light jokes wander through your mind because humility keeps them alive. 1. Bread is honest to a fault. 2. If timing were easy, everyone would be good at this. 3. The oven never lies. It just waits for you to lie to yourself. You notice how quickly you intervene now compared to years ago. Not sooner, more precisely. You wait longer before deciding something is wrong, but when you decide, you act without hesitation. That balance only comes from seeing enough failures to trust your judgment again. There's a fringe idea among historians that bakeries functioned as informal schools of failure, where knowledge advanced through shared errors rather than isolated success. Burned bread didn't disappear quietly. It was seen, smelled, tasted. Lessons spread fast in a city where everyone ate the same thing. You correct another loaf's position, catching a problem before it becomes one. That's the quiet victory nobody applauds. Prevention never feels dramatic. It just feels calm. Historians still argue whether this accumulated failure-driven timing knowledge could survive generational gaps. What happens when an experienced baker dies suddenly? Did timing reset, or did the community hold it together? You suspect continuity came from density. Too many people knew a little for everything to be lost at once. I glance at the apprentices again. They're calmer now, more deliberate. They've seen enough small mistakes today to respect waiting. You don't need to warn them anymore. Bread has done the talking. Outside, the city moves on, indifferent to your internal reckoning. That's fine. Failure is private, even when it's public. You fold it into your timing quietly, letting it slow you where you'd once rushed, sharpen you where you'd once drifted. The next batch comes out right. Not perfect, but right. You feel the familiar, low satisfaction settle in your chest. This is what learning looks like when it works. Not excitement, just steadiness. Timing, you've learned, isn't about avoiding mistakes forever. It's about recognizing them faster each time and letting them tune you instead of break you. And as the oven settles again, embers glowing evenly, you know that every loaf from here on carries the memory of the ones that went wrong, and that's exactly why they go right.
The talk starts quietly, as it always does, outside your walls, somewhere between scholars, hobbyists, and people who really want ancient life to make sense in modern terms. You don't hear it directly, of course, but you feel its echo in the way people look at your work centuries later, trying to reverse engineer what you already know by feel. This is where science leans in, curious and slightly frustrated. The mainstream historical fact anchoring this section is that modern archaeologists and historians actively study Roman ovens and bakeries, especially those preserved in places like Pompeii, to understand ancient baking practices. They measure oven dimensions, analyze residue, and recreate fires, all in an effort to estimate how long and how hot Roman baking actually was. Clocks arrive very late to the party. You imagine them now, serious faces lit by experimental flames, checking instruments, scribbling notes. They want numbers. They want ranges. They want to say, a Roman loaf baked for approximately X minutes at Y degrees. And sometimes they can get close, surprisingly close, close enough to be impressive, but never close enough to feel finished. A quirky tidbit drifts in from the edges of this research world. Some experimental bakers report that once they stop watching thermometers and start watching the oven itself, their results improve. This annoys the data purists immensely.
You sympathize with both sides. Numbers are comforting. Attention is demanding. Historians still argue whether modern reconstructions can ever fully capture ancient timing without replicating ancient daily life itself. Can you really understand Roman baking if you go home to a digital clock afterward? Or does true accuracy require the full immersion, the noise, the fatigue, the unpredictability? Standing here in your imagined bakery, you'd argue immersion matters more than precision. You adjust a loaf again, small movement, automatic. You don't know how long it's been inside. You know how far along it is. That distinction is everything, and it's the one modern explanations struggle to convey. Progress is not the same as duration. A few light jokes float through your thoughts, because academic seriousness always invites them. 1. Somewhere, a spreadsheet is crying because you exist. 2. If timing could be downloaded, nobody would bother practicing. 3. Approximately is doing a lot of work in those reconstructions. You think about how often modern people ask, how long did it take? And how rarely they ask, how did you know it was ready? The first question assumes time is external. The second admits it might be relational. Your entire craft lives in that second question. There's a fringe scholarly idea that Roman bakers possessed a kind of situational timing literacy, an ability to synthesize multiple weak signals into a strong decision. Not mystical, not magical, just deeply practiced. You like that phrasing. Literacy implies learning, not instinct alone. You watch the oven mouth, the way heat shimmers faintly, bending the air. That shimmer tells you as much as any thermometer ever could. It's subtle, easy to miss if you're distracted. You aren't. Distraction is a luxury this job never offered. Historians still argue whether ancient timing methods were inherently less accurate than modern ones. The assumption is yes. You'd challenge that gently. Less standardized, sure. Less portable, absolutely. But inaccurate, only if accuracy is defined by numbers instead of results. You pull the loaves at exactly the right moment. Again, no celebration, no relief, just quiet confirmation. The oven did what it was supposed to do. You did too. Somewhere in the future, someone will write about this and try to explain it cleanly. They'll do their best. They'll get many things right. But the part they'll struggle with most is this. Timing wasn't a thing you had. It was something you were inside of. And as the bread cools and the oven settles, you realize that no reconstruction will ever fully capture that feeling. Not because it's mysterious, but because it only exists when you're paying attention. Time here refuses to be pinned down, and that's exactly why it works.
Night arrives without ceremony. It always does. There's no bell for it in your world, no announcement, just a soft thinning of light, a cooling of stone, a subtle change in how sound travels. You notice it first in the oven. The heat relaxes. Not quickly, not dramatically. It loosens its grip the way tired hands do. This is the hour modern timelines forget. Most reconstructions focus on peak activity, the busy dawn, the rush before markets open, the efficiency of production. But your understanding of time deepens after the loaves are done, when nothing urgent remains, and yet the work is not over. The oven still breathes, ash still shifts, heat still exists, just quieter. You stay. This too is timing. The embers glow a darker red now, no longer commanding attention, but still readable. You know how long they'll hold warmth, not in minutes, but in usefulness. Enough to dry tools, enough to warm water, enough to make tomorrow easier. You plan with heat the way others plan with daylight. In some bakeries, a smaller batch goes in now, experimental loaves, personal ones, not for sale, not for schedule. These are the breads that teach you things, because failure here costs nothing. You change hydration slightly, you shape differently, you watch how the gentler heat behaves. You don't rush these loaves, there's no external pressure to finish. Time stretches, not because it's longer, but because it's unclaimed. This is a sensation modern people rarely experience, duration without demand. Outside, the city quiets unevenly. Taverns still hum, footsteps echo less often. Somewhere, water continues its steady argument with stone. You listen, but you don't count. Sound at night isn't a clock, it's reassurance that the world hasn't vanished. If someone asked you how long the oven takes to cool, you could answer approximately, but that wouldn't be useful. What matters is when it stops being an oven and becomes warm masonry. That transition has no timestamp, it has a feel. Scholars sometimes miss this distinction. They talk about Roman timekeeping as if it were only about coordination, markets opening, baths closing, ceremonies beginning. But your life proves another layer existed, maintenance time, residual time, the hours where nothing official happens, but everything important settles.
You sweep ash slowly. Too fast and you stir dust. Too slow and you waste heat. Your pace isn't chosen consciously. It emerges from repetition. This is how timing embeds itself into muscle and bone. You could not explain it clearly if asked. You could only demonstrate. A quiet thought surfaces, uninvited. Tomorrow will come whether you measure it or not. That idea feels obvious to you, but it will trouble people in the future. They'll build entire systems to tame that uncertainty. You didn't. You adapted to it instead. There's a faint humor in realizing this. Someone centuries from now will say ancient people were less precise. You look at your work, consistent loaves, predictable outcomes, a rhythm stable enough to feed a city, and you almost laugh. Precision just lived in a different place. You sit for a moment. Sitting is allowed now. The oven no longer needs you. This pause has weight, not leisure exactly, more like alignment. Your body matches the tempo of the cooling room. Breath slows, shoulders drop. This is the moment where time, if it were a thing, would become visible. But it doesn't. It dissolves instead. You are aware of sequence without being aware of speed. Things happen, but they don't hurry. Modern language struggles here. Words like downtime or after hours don't quite fit. This isn't absence of work. It's the completion of a cycle. Tomorrow's baking is already beginning, just invisibly. You secure the space, cover what needs covering, leave what needs air. Each choice is small, but they add up. They always do. Timing, you've learned, is mostly about accumulation, of cues, of habits, of tiny decisions that stack quietly until something is ready. Before leaving, you glance once more at the oven mouth. Old habit. You don't expect surprises, but you look anyway. Attention costs nothing now. That's why you give it freely. Outside, the street feels different under your feet. Cooler, slightly damp. Night has its own texture. You walk without urgency, guided by familiarity rather than visibility. You know where you are because your body remembers. Somewhere in the future, someone will read about Roman hours, Roman days, Roman schedules. They'll draw diagrams, they'll make charts, they'll argue footnotes. None of those will capture this walk. This is time unmeasured, but not unstructured. It has shape, density, and direction, just no numbers. And as you move through it, uncounted and unrecorded, it carries you forward anyway. Tomorrow will smell like bread again.
You wake into a world that looks nothing like Rome, and yet, oddly, feels familiar. Stainless steel replaces brick. Digital displays glow where embers once did. Someone nearby taps a touchscreen with the confidence of a god controlling fire. And still, bread behaves the same. You stand in a modern bakery, watching people try to forget their clocks. They say it out loud, almost ceremonially. Today, we bake like the Romans. The timers are silenced, the probes are set aside, the phones are flipped face down, like guilty secrets. There's a nervous excitement in the room, the kind that shows up when people voluntarily abandon control. You recognize it immediately. You lived inside it. At first, everyone compensates. They hover, they overcheck, they open the oven too often, losing heat and pretending not to notice. You want to tell them to relax, but of course you don't. This is a lesson that only lands when it's felt. The first mainstream fact becomes obvious quickly. Bread does not actually require clocks to exist. Fermentation still happens, crust still browns, steam still does what steam has always done. The laws of physics remain politely indifferent to human scheduling preferences. What changes is the baker. You watch someone lean closer to the oven glass, tilting their head the way you used to. They're not reading numbers anymore, they're reading behavior. The loaf lifts, then settles. The surface dulls, then shines. A faint crackle begins, quiet but unmistakable. Their shoulders loosen. Something clicks. A small smile appears, unplanned. There's a quirky tidbit the experimental bakers love to repeat. When timers are removed, people report that bread feels like it takes less time. Not because it does, but because attention fills the gap. Duration shrinks when awareness expands. No one can quite explain why, but everyone notices it. Historians still argue whether ancient bakers would recognize modern bread as bread at all. Different grains, different yeasts, different hydration levels. But when you watch hands respond instinctively to dough, those differences feel cosmetic. The relationship is intact. One baker tries counting breaths, half joking. They lose track immediately. Another listens to the room, the hum of refrigeration, the distant clatter of pans, the soft hiss when steam escapes. Without meaning to, they sync their movements to those sounds. You almost laugh. Street noise or machine noise, it hardly matters. Rhythm finds a way. There's resistance, of course. Someone asks, but how do you scale this? It's the modern prayer: efficiency, replicability, metrics. You remember similar anxieties expressed differently. How to feed a growing city, how to keep prices fair, how to avoid waste. The questions are old, only the vocabulary is new. The answer hasn't changed either.
You scale by training perception. It's uncomfortable advice. It doesn't fit neatly into spreadsheets. You can't download it. You can only practice it, fail with it, slowly become quieter inside it. That makes people uneasy. Clocks feel safer. Clocks never forget. But clocks also never learn. In one corner, a baker pulls a loaf slightly earlier than planned. No plan existed technically, but expectation did. They hesitate, then commit. The crest sings softly as it cools. They tap it. Hollow. Right. Relief ripples through them like they've passed a test they didn't know they were taking. Another loaf goes too far, darker than intended. Not ruined, but close. They smell it before they see it. That moment lands hard. A mistake without a timestamp feels personal, even though it isn't. You remember that feeling well. Failure sticks longer when it can't be blamed on a tool. There's a light joke floating around the room now. Someone says they feel like they're free-range baking. It gets a laugh. 3 laughs, actually, because by now everyone's a little punchy. Letting go of clocks is surprisingly tiring. Awareness burns energy. Yet something else happens too. Conversation slows, movement smooth out. People stop asking how long and start asking how does it look. The language shifts. Time retreats from the center of attention. By the end of the day, no one claims enlightenment. That would be suspicious. But several people admit they enjoyed it more than expected. One said they felt less chased. Another said they slept better the night before, knowing they wouldn't be racing alarms. You nod internally. Of course they did. There's a subtle scholarly debate wrapped up in all this, whether ancient timing methods were actually less precise, or whether they simply optimized for different variables: resilience, adaptability, embodied knowledge. Precision can mean hitting the same number every time, or it can mean responding correctly to changing conditions. Those are not the same skill. Modern ovens try to mimic what old ones did naturally. Steam injection replaces soaked floors. Thermal mass is engineered instead of inherited. Sensors approximate what eyes once judged. It works remarkably well. But watching people voluntarily step back from those aids reveals something important. Technology didn't replace intuition. It just made it optional. As the experiment winds down, someone asks the question that always comes eventually. So, should we stop using timers altogether? The room goes quiet. No one wants to sound foolish. The answer, when it comes, is gentle. No. You never rejected tools. You just refused to let them lead. Clocks are fine servants, terrible masters. The Roman way wasn't about purity or nostalgia. It was about attention. Tools existed, sundials existed, water clocks existed, but none of them stood between you and the bread. That balance is the hard part. As the bakers clean up, they check their phones again. Messages flood back in. The world resumes its measured insistence. But something lingers, a small recalibration, a sense that time doesn't always need to be negotiated aggressively. You leave the space knowing most of them will go back to timers tomorrow. That's fine. But 1 or 2 will hesitate before setting them. They'll listen first. They'll look longer. And occasionally, they'll trust themselves. That's enough. The ancient method survives not as a rule, but as a possibility. Quiet, patient, waiting to be remembered whenever someone dares to ask less of the clock and more of their senses.
By the time you return to yourself, wherever yourself happens to be now, the idea of time feels slightly altered. Not shattered, not rejected, just softened around the edges, like bread that's rested long enough to relax its crumb. You notice it in small ways first. You wait for something without filling the gap. You let silence exist without reaching for proof that it's passing. You realize how often modern life asks you to account for every minute, like time is a suspicious expense. And you smile, faintly, because you've spent a long while living inside a system that never asked for receipts. The final mainstream fact is almost boring in its simplicity. Roman bakers fed millions of people consistently, daily, across an empire that spanned climates and cultures, without mechanical clocks controlling their ovens. The system worked. Not occasionally, reliably, for centuries. That alone should slow you down for a second. The quirky detail that lingers, though, is smaller and stranger. Some Roman bakeries likely ran slightly differently depending on who was on duty. Not because of sloppiness, but because timing lived in individuals. One baker's done was a shade darker. Another's was lighter, airier. Customers noticed. They even preferred certain bakers. Imagine that. Time having a personality. Historians still argue whether this variability was considered a flaw or a feature. Was standardization the goal, or was consistency defined more loosely, through trust and familiarity rather than exact replication? The sources don't settle it cleanly. Life rarely does. As you sit with that uncertainty, you realize it doesn't bother you.
You've grown comfortable with things that can't be pinned down. You understand now that timing isn't always about when something happens. It's about readiness. And readiness can't be forced. It has to be sensed. This understanding sneaks into your modern habits. You pull something from the oven a moment earlier than the recipe says, because it feels right. You leave it in a touch longer another time, ignoring the beep that insists it's finished. You trust your eyes more, your nose, your patience. A light joke drifts through your mind. If ancient Romans saw how many alarms you set just to wake up, they'd assume you were being hunted. You exhale through your nose. Fair enough. You also notice how tiring constant measurement can be. Every timer demands attention twice, once when you said, once when it interrupts you. The Roman method asked for sustained presence instead. Different effort, different fatigue, but also a different kind of calm. The city you live in now doesn't slow down the way Rome did at night. Lights stay on, screens glow. Time is always visible, always asserting itself. Yet you carry something quieter with you, a sense that beneath all that precision, the old rhythms still hum. Heat still rises, dough still changes, shadows still move, people still get hungry at roughly the same times. The world hasn't changed as much as the interfaces have. You think back to the oven cooling, to the walk home through dark streets, to the way time dissolved when nothing demanded it. That memory feels oddly comforting, like recalling a place you didn't realize you'd miss. If someone asked you now how Roman bakers timed their ovens without clocks, you could answer with facts. Thermal mass, wood types, sensory cues, city rhythms. You could explain it clearly. But you might choose a different answer. You might say they paid attention. Not aggressively, not anxiously, just fully enough to notice when something was ready to become something else. That's not an ancient skill. It's a human one. And as you settle back into the present, into your chair, your bed, your quiet room, you let that idea stretch out and soften. There's nowhere else you need to be right now. No alarm waiting to claim you. Just the gentle sense that time will keep moving, whether you track it or not. You don't have to chase it. You can meet it where it is.